In the last podcast, we analyzed the difficult decision made by Robert E. Lee to reject Lincoln's offer to lead the Union Army and to accept the offer to lead the Confederate Army in the American Civil War. Then we looked at his impressive skill as a commander in the first 2 years of the war, winning victories against the odds on several occasions, culminating in the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Lee's army delivered a crippling blow to General Burnside's Union troops. In this second part of the series, we'll see how things began to change in 1863 as Lee encountered insurmountable circumstances. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University. This is another Muskogee County School District podcast. Robert E. Lee, Part 2. After the Confederate victory at Fredericksburg, both armies laid low for the remainder of the winter. But in the spring, President Lincoln appointed a general named Joseph Hooker to make the next attempt at attacking and capturing General Lee. The battle took place at Chancellorsville, Virginia, and it was another tremendous embarrassment to the Union Army. Stonewall Jackson led his men on a stealth attack against Hooker's army that nearly decimated his troops. But in spite of the overwhelming Confederate victory, there was one terrible mistake made that General Lee later said cost him the war. Later that night, General Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by Confederate guards as he returned to camp. General Jackson had to have his left arm amputated, and the outcome was fatal. General Lee's response was,
"General Jackson has lost his left arm, and I have lost my right arm."
General Lee's implication, of course, was that General Jackson was his right arm, and that Lee could probably not function as well without him. But General Lee's army was clearly on a roll. Lee was leading his men to victory over the Union Army again and again against the odds, with inferior numbers and with less supplies. General Lee later admitted that these successes made him feel that his men were invincible. Well, as a result, Lee decided to make a bold move northward into Pennsylvania. If he could win a decisive battle in a northern theater, there was good chance that the English might recognize the Confederate States of America and provide them aid. That would indeed force Lincoln to concede. On the other hand, if Lee didn't make a bold move, Union General Grant was about to cut off the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, and that would be fatal for the Confederacy. So at this critical juncture, Lee made the decision to invade Pennsylvania. When General Lee arrived with his men at Gettysburg, he was missing two of his most important generals. General Jeb Stuart, the commander of his cavalry, who was responsible for providing information about the enemy's position and strength, decided to go off with the cavalry on his own. And more importantly, General Stonewall Jackson was not there either. He died from pneumonia brought on by his accidental shooting at Chancellorsville in May. Nonetheless, when General Lee's army entered Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on July 1, 1863, they romped over General Reynolds' corps and took control of the town. Lee requested that General Ewell, who was Stonewall Jackson's replacement, seize the high hills on the outside of town. But Ewell didn't even attempt to do so. Ewell's failure to take the high ground was a critical error that Stonewall Jackson certainly would not have made. Lee later said,
"Had I had Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg, I would have won a great victory. and established freedom for the South.
The next day, Lee began to order attacks on the Union troops that were perched on the high hills near Gettysburg: Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Little Round Top. But the day ended with the Union troops maintaining control of the high ground. On the second night, Lee had to make the most important decision of the war. Should he retreat, or should he try one more time? The stakes were very high. If he could win there, it might mean the end of the war with the Confederates winning. But if he were to retreat, Vicksburg could fall, and that might certainly spell defeat. Although he knew that the odds were stacked against him, he also knew that the odds had been stacked against him before. He sensed that his men were ready to finish the job there at Gettysburg, and he was feeling both invincible and impatient. So his decision was made. On the third day at Gettysburg, Lee ordered thousands of his men to attack the center of Cemetery Ridge. It truly was a suicide mission. The attack, known as Pickett's Charge, was an utter failure. As the few men who didn't die in the attack returned to the Confederate lines, Lee humbly addressed them.
This has been all my fault, and upon my shoulders rests the blame. I thought my men were invincible.
The battle at Gettysburg was General Lee's first conclusive defeat, and it was pivotal. Now, the Union General Meade could have and should have followed up with a counterattack, but he didn't. And to Lincoln's tremendous disappointment, Lee's remaining army escaped back to Virginia. Well, the day after that, General Grant took Vicksburg, Mississippi, and cut off the Mississippi River. So Grant was soon invited by Lincoln to take on the task of finally finishing off General Lee in Virginia. In our final podcast, we'll finish the story of Robert E. Lee, how General Grant captured him, and the way in which he finished his life after the war. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University. This has been another Muskogee County School District podcast. Robert E. Lee, Part 2.